be worth it for a dozen people. I think it is simply that it's this ballroom as opposed to the other one.
Okay, and we're about less than a minute.
Okay. I'm gonna move around a fair bit. Yeah, yeah.
I'm not going to be here, but somebody will be here. But yeah, no, that's fine. You can move. Once again, you aren't amplified, so you just have to speak up. Okay, we're locked down at 10 seconds. Just like that.
Okay. I'll launch straight in then. Okay. Well, thanks those few of you who have turned up for this. I think I'll sort of come amongst you, as it were, so I don't have to shout from back there. And maybe if a few more people sort of turn up, I'll sort of get back a bit. But I don't know, was anyone at my lecture yesterday? Well, yesterday what I did was essentially give a history of the British government's UFO project, really from its inception in 1950, with a little bit of earlier stuff about Foo Fighters and ghost rockets, and bringing it forward to the mid-50s. What I want to do now is just really focus in much more on my own tour of duty, running that particular project from 1991 to 1994, but particularly because it's such a sort of small and intimate audience here, I want to make this much more friendly and interactive. So rather than me talking at you for an hour and a half, please, if we get to a point, where you want to just chip in and interrupt me and shout out a question and say, hey, but what about the crop circles, or what about this, what about that? Then just please do so. As ever, I have to give the usual disclaimers in that even though I still work for the Ministry of Defence, I am here entirely in a private capacity. So please don't think that I'm appearing as an official spokesperson or anything like that. And as with the talk yesterday, just to confirm that as this is a public open briefing, of course the level of this presentation is unclassified. Anyway, what I want to really kick off in is something which will give you an idea of what I did running that UFO project, which was really the British equivalent of the United States Air Force Project Bluebird, and go through a bit of the policy, go through some cases, and we may dip into the Bentwaters case as well, even though that was before my time, but kind of one or two things happened during my tour of duty which involved me retrospectively having a look at that. So we'll get into some Bentwaters stuff, and we'll just see where we go. But what I want to leave you with, by the end of this, is a kind of sense that you've got almost a feel of what it was like, if you picked a day at random, say, and you could sort of step into the office and see what was going on the project. Anyway, I will kick off by just saying, because again, I'm trying to address questions that I'm often asked, and one of the questions that comes up most frequently is, well, how the heck did you get a job like that? I joined the Ministry of Defence back in 1985, and what they used to do at the time is give you tours of duty which would last anything between 2 and 4 years. So they moved you around a lot so that you might do a job in personnel, a job in finance, a job in casework, policy, operations. You might do a private office job in the office of a senior minister or a senior civil servant or service person. So anyway, I had done 2 or 3 different jobs, and during the first Gulf War, I had been pulled off my normal peacetime duties and asked to become an augmentee in what was then called the Joint Operations Centre, and specifically in the Air Force Operations Room. And my job was basically, it was a combination of watchkeeping, and I was a briefer. Typically, this has nothing to do with UFOs, by the way, but I'm just setting the scene, life at the ministry. You know, a typical night shift during the Gulf War would just involve my sitting there waiting for the phone to ring or not, and then waiting, particularly because it was an Air Force thing, for the nightly bombing raids to be done. And then at the end, when the reports came in, and when the specialist Air Force staff were doing bomb damage assessment and things like that, I would get the data, and then I would have to sort of turn that into a sort of concise summary. And of course, the key issue that everyone wanted to know, of course, was, did all our people get back safely? But then, once that question had hopefully been answered in the affirmative, sadly sometimes it wasn't, but once you got past that, then you got into, well, my role as a briefer is I get all this technical information, and then I have to write it up into a few paragraphs and say, a formation of Tornado GR-1 fighter bombers with top cover and other support elements launched a series of raids on oil refinery targets or on military airfields or whatever. And, I would have to assess all this information and pick out what were really the key points that, that ministers and that the service chiefs would need. Sorry about that, totally irrelevant, but I thought it was, just to tell you what I was doing immediately before the UFO job. And then the connection, the reason I got the UFO job was that in the Joint Operations Centre, I had worked quite closely with a particular civil servant. And I think I'd impressed him by my willingness to, at short notice, say, do an extra night shift, or just, my ability to just get my head down and get on with the job. And he said to me, after the Gulf War, when this is all over, I know that you've said that you're looking to do another job. As it happens, I have a vacancy. How would you like to throw in what you were doing before? Come and work for me. And I said, what would that job entail? And the answer was, you would be running the MOD's UFO project. Okay? So I thought, well, that's intriguing. I think I knew vaguely that we had a UFO project because I'd seen it in the telephone directory, and I thought, what the heck are we doing with all that? But, so needless to say, I sort of jumped at the chance and thought, well, I don't know what the next 3 years are going to entail, but I'll give it a shot. It sounds interesting. I'll learn something I didn't know before, and, we'll just see what happens. Little did I know that those 3 years were really going to transform my life, and turn me from, the sort of conservative, the anonymous grey civil servant to now a grey-haired civil servant, all the stress of UFO research and work. But no, little did I realise on day one in that job just what on earth I was, or what not on earth, I was letting myself in for. So I arrived on day one, and back in those days you used to have a handover from the previous incumbent. So, you would shadow whoever had that job before. You would stay there for about a week. On the Friday, he would have his leaving due. Everyone would go down to the pub. And on Monday morning of the next week, I would get in and think, help, I'm on my own now. What the heck do I do? Well, one of the things that I did was to start reading back through some of the old government files so that I could actually see, the history of the project, what my predecessors had done, what some of the more interesting cases over the years had actually been. So I tried to read myself into the subject, but as ever, you can't learn it from the files. What you actually then have to do is just learn it at the sharp end. And what that meant was just simply waiting for the particular UFO reports to come in. And that's exactly what they did. But just again, quickly, for those of you who weren't at the lecture yesterday, a sort of fairly fundamental question that I haven't addressed. Why does the Ministry of Defence have a UFO project at all? It's not because we are absolutely convinced of an extraterrestrial presence. It's simple military common sense. You need to know what's flying in your airspace. If there's an uncorrelated target, particularly if it's picked up on radar, if something is operating within the United Kingdom's air defence region, if you don't know what that something is, and particularly again with the radar in mind, if the fighter controllers on the ground are saying, well, this looks, we assess this as a solid structured craft, and hey, its speed and maneuver is a little bit beyond what we would expect. What the heck is it? Then of course you need to sit up, pay attention, and take a look. It doesn't mean, as I've often said, that there's a corporate belief in Martians. Rather, there is a corporate belief in Russians. I mean, that's probably the mindset that really explains, how we got into this. Is this some form of Soviet, going back to the inception of the project, could these things be some form of Soviet secret weapon? Look at the whole Ghost rocket wave of 1946. When people in the official documents were using phrases like Russian flying bombs and such like. So that shows you the mindset, and that's the angle from which we came. So the policy, that's the reason for having the project, is sort of because we have the reports. So we need to kind of actually take a look. The Ministry of Defence's reason, as it were, is when you see this articulated on their website, as I believe it is at the moment in a policy statement, is, well, we look at these reports, evaluating them to see whether there's evidence of any threat to the defence of the United Kingdom. It goes on to say something like, if no such evidence is found, we make no effort to chase down each and every sighting. Well, I did when I was there, and I'll come back to that. But again, just to give you the Ministry of Defence party line, as it were, there's this marvellous phrase that UFOs are of, quote, no defence significance, unquote. What I think that probably means is they haven't actually started firing on anyone in UK airspace. But I'll come back to kind of issues about threat and defence and national security issues. Just maybe some fairly basic things first, like how many reports do we get? I used to get about 200 or 300 reports even each year, and that was interesting. 200 or 300. That sounds like, well, that's enough to keep me busy. So when people said to me, how many reports does that mean, how many sightings does that mean there were? Well, I would say probably several thousand. And, people would say, well, how do you figure that out? And I would say, well, two reasons. First reason is that not any one organisation has a monopoly on the UFO sightings. The Ministry of Defence gets UFO sightings, and because we had, in theory, although it was breaking down in places, a national UFO reporting system, we should also have swept up reports from anyone who had reported to a military base, to a police station, or to a civil airport. But while we should have got those reports, and I think generally speaking those fed into the 200 or 300 a year, we clearly weren't getting reports that went to UFO groups, many of whom distrusted us and thought we were the enemy, of course. And I'll come back to, relations between the ministry and between ufologists later, because I think that's quite interesting in itself. So we wouldn't get those reports. Neither would we get the media reports. And obviously a lot of people would report particularly to local newspapers. And just to give a little analogy, and sorry, the other reason, of course, is the classic underreporting more generally. If people report to the Ministry of Defence, to the media, and to UFO groups, supposing that gives you, 1,000 reports a year if we get 200 or 300. Figure that most people who've seen a UFO won't report it to anyone at all, either because they don't know who to report to, or because they fear ridicule. Something quite interesting happens at local media level, and I've seen it time and time again. Somebody reports a UFO sighting to a small local newspaper, and they run a little story on it, maybe half a column, and it's like, Mr. Smith was out walking his dog, and he saw this strange light in the sky, and he said, it moved in a funny way, and it's like nothing I ever saw before. And right at the end of the report of this, the editor will write a little piece on the end. Did you see the UFO? Have you had a sighting? Do you have a story to tell? Please let the news desk know. And you know what happens next. Next week, when the local paper runs, there are about half a dozen stories and letters and whatever. And this can become, people talk about UFO hotspots. Sometimes I think that's misleading. So these things can very often be self-fulfilling prophecies, that you will get this kind of momentum building up. And next thing, say, local radio steps in, and they'll want to interview one of the people. And then it's a short step to maybe one of the nationals picking it up. And then you get these hotspots in Britain over the years, places like Warminster, places like Bonnybridge, places like Rendlesham Forest. Well, we'll come on to Rendlesham Forest later, and the whole Bentwaters case. People say that Rendlesham Forest is still a UFO hotspot. Well, yes, in a literal sense it is, but bear in mind the reason it's a hotspot is because people are specifically going there to do sky watches. It doesn't mean that things aren't seen somewhere else, but there's just no one there to see them. We're back to trees falling over in forests and nowhere, literally, and there's no one there to see it. When you get people going on a sky watch to somewhere like Rendlesham Forest, next to Bentwaters, they'll probably see something. So these things build up ahead of steam. So that's a very long way of saying that the 200 or 300 reports that I got each year were quite obviously, because no one had a monopoly on them and because of the chronic under-reporting, it was the tip of the iceberg. What's the real annual figure for the UK? I don't know. Numbers of people, you simply can't say, but I would say it's certainly several thousand, extrapolating that. Then figure in, of course, that it's a global phenomenon. And by the way, again, the power of the media and the power of the internet, we might think of UFO sightings as being something from America, Britain, Canada, Belgium, and what have you. What about countries like Chad or Niger? I'm sure things are happening there. It's just that, there probably is not a network of ufologists there. There is probably not the access in terms of internet, or indeed access to even the more conventional forms of media. So global UFO sightings? I don't know, you tell me, but tens of thousands, I have no doubt. Now, where are we? Oh yes, one thing I should say. Although we didn't get the reports from UFO groups and from the media monitoring did mean that if there was a press cutting on a particular UFO sighting, then it would be drawn. It would have been drawn to my attention, so I could, I could pick up on what was going on, and I could pick up as well from relations with UFO researchers and UFO groups, and again I'll come back to that in a bit. I want now to just go on to investigation, and actually give you that sense of what I was doing. Well, as I like to say sometimes, sadly, it wasn't quite like the X-Files. I had to wear a suit, but I never had one of those long coats. I never had a torch, and I never had Scully. But I did have some administrative assistants and such like. But anyway, I can dream. But it was all rather more. I don't like to use the word mundane, because I don't think that, saying I used to investigate UFOs for the government can ever be considered mundane. But it was, having said that, it was not X-Files. Why didn't they turn the lights on ever rather than, the torches? But anyway, my job, the way in which I would investigate these things was there was a methodology, there was a science behind it. There was a logical progression of steps. Intellectually, I knew, both from looking at the British government's old files and indeed from having access to some of the old Blue Book material, I knew that, broadly speaking, although these figures are often disputed, you might say 80 or 85% of UFOs explained, around another sort of 10% insufficient data to make a firm determination, and then, around about 5%, say, unknown, after having, reasonable amounts of data on which to investigate, and yet still come up a blank. And to go into that unknown basket, a sighting would have to be pretty good. It would have to have a number of sort of motifs to it that mark a sighting out as good, like a multiple witness sighting, a sighting from a trained observer such as a police officer, a civil pilot, military personnel, a radar visual sighting, something in extremis, something where maybe aircraft were launched, and that's happened on plenty of times over the years, something where a good video or photo was submitted, and where that photo was subsequently sent by us, through our own specialists for technical analysis and enhancement. So, I knew that intellectually most UFOs would turn out to be misidentifications. So the bread and butter of the investigation, the nuts and bolts of what I did on a day-to-day basis was run through a fairly obvious series of checks. Like I would have maps which would have out, the locations of military air bases, civil flight paths. I would have access to what was then called NOTAMs, notices to airmen. Those are aviators amongst you. I don't know, if they still use that term, but it's basically whatever you want to do. Yes, I'm being told that they do. If I wanted to, if I was organising a hang gliding competition, or if I was launching a nightclub and was going to be using very powerful searchlights, I would put a NOTAM out, and that would tell all users of airspace that something was going to be going on. So they would have to either avoid it completely or just be aware of it and manage it. So I would be able to look at flight paths. I would be able to look at the NOTAMs. I would be able to speak to people like, for example, staff at the Royal Observatory Greenwich to see if there was an astronomical explanation. Maybe Venus was particularly bright at that particular time. Maybe it was a night that there was a meteor shower. Maybe a big fireball was reported. I would I would familiarize myself with the launch points and launch times of that great skeptical friend of ours, the weather balloon. I didn't really get into the whole swamp gas issue. And not surprisingly, oh, by the way, I used to kind of sometimes put out my own equivalent of NOTAMs, but for the duty officers, because I ran the UFO project and I would get reports, say, sent overnight that would come into the Air Force operations room, which was staffed 24 hours a day, I would, if I knew in advance that something unusual was going to happen, which I knew from historical data, you know, and just cases I'd looked at before, was likely to give rise to a sighting, I would let the press office know, and I would let the Air Force duty officer know. And I would say, look, there's going to be a big outdoor concert in Hyde Park, and they're going to be using, you know, the world's most powerful lasers and searchlights. And this is going to be going on between, you know, 2100 hours and 2300 hours. So, you know, duty officers, desk officers, please be aware, if you get reports from that particular location, you know, of lights chasing around the sky, you know, bear in mind this is what it is, offer it up as a potential solution to the caller. I would have, back in those days, it was slightly easier in terms of airships. There was only one company at the time that operated airships in UK airspace. And it's common sense. I had them fax me on a monthly basis their flight schedule. So every day, you know, I would have in the back of my mind, okay, today the airship is over London. Is there a big football match that it's going to be looking at? Is there some sort of corporate hospitality thing? You know, Tuesday, are they up in Manchester? Wednesday, are they in Edinburgh? You know, so when I got in, reports of a brightly lit, slow-moving, white cigar-shaped object moving very slowly across the night sky, you know, I would have this fax in front of me and I would say, yep, that's where the airship was. And, you know, my job, as it were, was to explain, not to debunk. You know, I would never say to people, that is definitely what you saw. But I would put the facts as I understood them in front of people and say, well, this is what I know has happened, and I invite you to consider whether that is the potential explanation for what you saw. Now, sometimes, you know, people really kind of won't take that. You know, and sometimes, you know, sometimes there are things which make you wonder why you're doing the job at all. I received a report once from somebody who reported a bright white light in the sky, and I asked for further details. And well, yes, this is really strange. On either side of the white light, there was a red light and a green light, and they were flashing. And I said, well, can I ask where this happened? And the person concerned said, well, I don't live that far from Heathrow, next to the airport, and I've just moved there. And I said, well, it's a tough one, but my best guess, well, anyway. On another occasion, you know, that there is a humorous side of this. By the way, I like the thing up there. Anyway, now that is a good one. It's just a weather balloon. Anyway, on one occasion, I was phoned up by the community relations officer at a particular military base, and she told me an anecdote. And she said that on one night she had been. Oh, and by the way, do any of you know the E3D Sentry aircraft, the AWACS, the Airborne Early Warning? You know, basically with the big rotating radar dome on the top, the giant Smarty, to use the non-technical term. You know. Anyway, this radome can be illuminated quite brightly at night by the lights from the aircraft, and indeed at low level from the lights, you know, at the facility itself. And this woman, this community relations officer, told me that one evening she was driving back to the base, RAF Waddington, and she said there was a little mini metro car driving along about 50 yards in front of her. And suddenly, she said, there was a sort of roaring sound, and she looked up and she saw one of the AWACS coming in. But she said she couldn't really make out the fuselage, just because of the lighting conditions. She could only see the radome, brightly lit, sort of, broadly disc-shaped going over. Anyway, she took her eyes off the road momentarily, but like a good professional, only for a second. By the time she looked back down again, the mini metro was in the ditch at the side of the road. And so she had to pull up her car and help the poor unfortunate man out of his car. And apparently he was semi-hysterical, talking about aliens. So, belief is an important thing to factor in, and ordinary objects seen under unusual viewing conditions. On another occasion, I received a call. It was an unusual call because most UFO sightings were reported to me retrospectively. So it would be, I was out walking the dog sometime last week, or I saw this really interesting thing last night. Now, I received this call from someone who said, I can see a UFO and I'm looking at it right now. And I'm telling you, it's over Regent's Park in London. And it's kind of like diamond-shaped. And, there are a lot of people staring around and pointing up. And, I think something quite interesting has happened. I said, well, okay, stay on the line and, relay me. I just wanted to get a sense of how this was going to unfold. And I said, look, stay on the line, and sort of keep talking. Tell me what's happening. And his voice got more and more excited. He was saying, yeah. He said, it seems to be coming down. And I said, is it possible that this could be a kite? And he said, no, it couldn't be a kite. He said, no. He said, it's diamond shaped, and there are a lot of people pointing, and they're all gathering around. It's coming down. It's on the ground. Oh, it was a kite. He said, they're putting it back in its box now. Yeah, thank you. On another occasion, there was an elderly man who reported that he lived on a housing estate, and one night he said there was a lot of noise and commotion. He looked up and he saw what he described as a beam of light coming down to the ground. And he said, next thing, he said, what he could only describe as a ladder descended, down this beam of light. And he said these entities came down, dressed in sort of bulky, spacesuits and such like. He said, I think they were spacemen or robots or something like that. Well, when we investigated, it transpired that this had been a Special Forces helicopter, and Special Forces personnel kitted up in the full works with night vision goggles, all the kit and whatever, had indeed come down a ladder. So it just shows you that there are sometimes, there was some humor in the job, and sometimes there were these kind of, ordinary things, but perhaps viewed by people who were not used to seeing them, or viewed under unusual lighting conditions, or in some sort of unusual circumstances. But as I've said, that's not what interests me, really. I mean, it does from a sociological point of view, but what's really of interest, of course, is the police sightings, the military sightings, the radar cases, the ones where something might land and there might be ground traces to have a look at. The structured craft with speeds and maneuvers going beyond the cutting edge of anything that we have. And that leads me to another question. People often say, well, yes, okay, couldn't these things be secret prototype military aircraft? Well, yes, of course, we have such things. There are always aircraft flying around that you won't see at the Farnborough, the Paris, whatever the big American air shows are. You won't see those things for 10 or 15 years, So there is some great kit out there, I'm sure. But we know where we fly our own bits of kit, and we have clearly defined test areas and proving grounds and such like. So we know where we fly them, we know where we don't fly them. And where we don't fly them is over the heads of the general public, particularly in built-up areas where there could be flight safety issues with a prototype and where there could be security issues with a prototype. What if someone gets a picture and it ends up on the front page of Jane's Defence Weekly? You know, the cat's out of the bag, as we say. So, no, although there are, of course, secret prototype aircraft, I do not believe that this is an explanation that can be deployed, certainly in most cases, with exotic UFO sightings. I'm not saying that over the years there haven't been the odd case where something has perhaps strayed outside an area or someone has perhaps strayed into an area where they shouldn't and have seen something. But generally speaking, I don't think that that's an explanation. Now, let me get back to some cases. Again, I want to start, again, just in the interests of giving you this overview, some explained cases, some unexplained cases. 9th of December 1991, a lot of people throughout Herefordshire in England report seeing a sort of fiery comet in the early evening. You know, so of course my first thought is, was this a fireball, but seen in the late afternoon? Well, if so, you know, a very bright fireball, maybe even something that has come down. You know, so I start talking to people like the Royal Observatory Greenwich to see if they have anything, but they don't. I start making all sorts of other checks, and right about at the end of a full day of just chasing my tail on this, a report came through from the Air Force that an American aircraft, an F-111, had just taken off, but its home base, the Met officer there was becoming increasingly concerned that the runway might be icy in another hour or so because of the deteriorating weather. And a decision was taken to recall this aircraft very quickly to base, even though it had just started its training sortie. And it did what's called a dump and burn. It just jettisoned its main fuel load for safety reasons, or most of it, and that ignited in the afterburners. And you know, dozens of people across the whole county had seen and reported a UFO, but because we were on the ball and because we were doing our jobs properly and, you know, checking these things and trying to chase them down, we managed to explain it. On 23rd of October 1993, 3 fishermen were out on the Norfolk Broads and they saw a UFO. There is no doubt about that. One of them happened to have with him a camcorder and took a video of this. But as the photographers among you will know, sometimes when you zoom in on a light source, you can get an image that the light, the little ball of light, will apparently resolve into what looks like a structured craft, but is in fact an image of the iris. And the clue to this is it's actually a very two-dimensional image. It looks like it's flat, as opposed to something of any substance. Now, this video was sent to me, and at the time, you know, I put it out around a number of people, and I think I was slightly misled by some of our technical specialists getting a little more excited than they should have done about this. People who should have known better, because they were getting almost caught up in the enthusiasm that there was this multi-witness case. 3 witnesses had seen something. So, you know, a major national newspaper then got hold of this story, and they were going to run something. Then we contacted the offices. I'm trying to remember who it was, Panasonic or Sony or what? Panasonic. Thanks, Tim Good, who was probably in on that investigation as well. Well, Tim will remember perhaps having seen this on TV with a very X-rated soundtrack Because or rather, seeing it completely silent on national television. When I was sent the original tape, these three characters were saying to each other, "Look at that! You won't believe your eyes. Look at that object." Me, you know. And you could tell the excitement in their voice. When this was shown on breakfast time television, people wondered why there was no sound. Well, didn't these guys say anything? Yes, they did. On 29th of October 1993, a naval cadet from the college at Dartmouth reported what I can only really describe as a close encounter of the third kind. He saw a massive, rather like that, you know, a big, brightly lit UFO, festooned with lights, the classic close encounters of the third kind thing. He also reported seeing a bird fly close to the UFO and then suddenly fall dead from the sky. He then received, and bear in mind, this is a naval cadet, a young trainee selected to go on to, you know, so that, you know, he's got through various academic and psychometric tests and such like, you know, and he relayed the fact that he had received what he could only describe as telepathic messages, saying things like, "Do not worry." Well, anyway, he reported this to his supervisors on the course, and I think the word came down, you know, don't speak about this, you know, and then I think the authorities at the Naval College informed the local police, and the police sent the report to me to kind of process in the usual way. Now, when this person was told, don't speak about this, I think, you know, some conspiracy theorists have interpreted that as, you know, they were trying to silence him. My own assessment is that that was not the case in this particular incident, and that actually what they were doing, it was advising the cadet for his own interests, you know, not to get hung up on this. Look, you're on your training course. You know, if you start talking about this, you're going to get some banter from the other cadets. It's going to become an issue. You're going to get distracted. You know, forget about it. Keep your head down. Get on with the course. You know, all I can say about that case is that there was never resolution. By the time I think the police went to the site, the bird had gone. Had it been there, I guess I would have ended up with a dead bird on my desk, and had to figure out where to send that. That would have been nice, arriving through the post. But the case file on that, you know, the incidents like that, what do you do? Very difficult to assess, very difficult to make any sort of judgment call. All I can say is you know, that the case file on that, well, it's sort of open. Nothing further is going to happen to that case now, but it's on the file, and it's one of the unknowns. February 1994, a place called Craiglascar Reservoir in Scotland. An artist goes out to take some pictures, which he will then use as the basis of doing some painting. He has a camera in his hand. Suddenly he says, flying towards him, low and slow, across the reservoir, a massive UFO. Interestingly, he said that he even though he was holding the camera, he had no sense that he was holding the camera. He had forgotten about the camera. He was almost in an altered state of consciousness, a trance, whatever sort of phrase you want to use. This object was there for a while, and then as it pulled away, he said it was as if he came out of the trance, and he saw this thing in his hand, and he said, "My goodness, what is it? It's my camera. There's a UFO, quick." and he fired off two fairly quick shots, one of which shows a sort of disc-shaped craft, but sadly, you know, at a reasonable distance and with no real other features, as far as I can recall, that would enable triangulation or whatever. So, you know, that's an interesting motif, by the way, that I'm sure those of you who've looked at UFO sightings, and particularly those of you who've got into the whole alien contact, alien abduction thing, will know. That sort of, you know, otherworldliness of this whole phenomenon. Excuse me while I reload with water. Anyway, another example of an interesting case with photographic evidence, a compelling account that I certainly couldn't debunk or find any conventional explanation for, rests on the case files, you know, unexplained. There was another UFO sighting from 1992. Somebody saw a black object in the Quantock Hills. Most of my contact was actually with his wife, who was very distressed because he was seriously ill. She said that this was clearly attributable to radiation from this craft. That's what they had come to believe. My advice was, of course, as it could only be in that case, this is an issue for the medical professionals. You know, I'm not going to start trying to do ufology in that kind of situation. But, you know, over a series of months, that situation rumbled on. It's very difficult sometimes to know what to do for the best. Sometimes I was contacted by people claiming abduction experiences. Again, my job was not to look at abductions or crop circles, but because I did this UFO job, you can bet that if there were these things reported, you know, where do you think they're going to come? Well, they come to me. You know, it was the real X-Files. There was nowhere else to send this weird stuff. And I would get, it wasn't in the formal job description, but, you know, there was nowhere else to send them. I once got a ghost report. Wasn't much I could do with that. Certainly I didn't think it was a defense issue. Once I got embroiled in a great situation, long before the current focus on the danger to the Earth from near-Earth objects, comets and asteroids. A member of Parliament wrote in about a story that he had seen in one of the astronomy magazines about a comet that might be on a near approach to Earth in, I think it was about the year 2129, and the MP said, "What are you going to do about it?" And that letter was passed around from department to department, and guess where it ended up? You know, guess which person was going to have to deal with this weird question that had never come up before, and you know, and I found myself speaking to the disaster preparedness unit at the Home Office and to the Royal Observatory at Greenwich and to various other people, and I ended up saying something like, as to how we would deal with it in the unlikely event that this is on collision course, I cannot possibly speculate as to what the level of technology will be over 100 years from now, but I am sure we will find a way. Now, as it happened, the good news in the first paragraph, before I got into that, was, look, don't worry, the latest astronomical intelligence is that it's going to miss us by a long way anyway. But again, interesting distractions to the main day-to-day business of UFOs. Is that loud? Okay. Maybe it's just loud for me. Right, where are we? Oh yes, before my time, but an interesting case, and one that I saw on the one of the closed files that I'd inherited, 5th of November 1990, some tornadoes are crossing the North Sea, and the pilot's report, and it was only a one-page standard signal reporting a UFO. It just said, was overtaken at high speed by object. and it's like, there's one page in the file. So my question was, well, hang on, didn't my predecessor investigate this? What happened next? Weren't the aircrew debriefed? Didn't we check the radar? It all got a bit messy, but and some other UFO researchers have done some work on that since, and have actually managed to secure the release of the document under the Code of Practice on Access to Government Information. Of course, what they haven't got is the name of the pilot, or rather the pilots. They've advertised in some Air Force magazines, and they've taken pot luck and written to a few RAF pilots that have written books about the Gulf War, just to say, hey, look, was this you? Do you know, was it any of the guys you trained with? Anyone on your squadron? So far, that's drawn a blank. But there is a researcher in Britain, Richard Foxhall, who is continuing to do some work into that. And it's something that if there is a breakthrough on that particular case, I'm sure it'll be in magazines.
It was confirmed by a high-ranking Air Force gentleman.
Tim Good says that it was confirmed by high-ranking Air Force gentlemen. Well, the other thing is that I just love the turn of phrase in some of these reports. We were overtaken at high speed by this object. Now, to be fair, it does say at the bottom, ID'd as possible stealth aircraft, but, I think that's, well, what else could we say? Anyway, object unexplained, rests on the case file to this day. Belgium 1990, a famous wave that I'm sure many of you will be familiar with. I'll just tell you my own sort of retrospective involvement in that, which just maybe confirms a few things that you may already know. In 1989, and more so in 1990, there was a very important wave of UFO sightings over Belgium, which culminated on the night of 30th and 31st of March 1990 in an incident where a UFO was seen by lots of people on the ground, but also tracked on radar, not just Belgian national radar, but NATO, part of the NATO integrated radar system. 2 F-16 fighters were launched. The pilots attempted to intercept. They believed that they got very brief lock-ons on a number of occasions, but every time they did, their assessment was that the object, whatever it was, broke the lock, and there was this cat and mouse game going on, over a major country in the NATO alliance. Well, what are you supposed to do with a case like that? Lots has been written on it. I found myself getting inquiries about it, even in 91, 92, 93, 94 when I had that job. So I checked. I contacted the British Embassy in Washington, and I said, no, I didn't. I contacted the British Embassy in Brussels. I'm getting my geography mixed up. That wasn't a Freudian slip. And oh dear, the conspiracy theorists will love that. It's all the Americans. I contacted the British Embassy in Washington, and I spoke, I can't remember, either to the defense attaché or to the air attaché. And I said, look, you're familiar with this case? And he said, yes, I am. I said, we're still getting inquiries about it here. Could you discreetly make a few inquiries with Colonel de Brouwer, one of the senior Belgian military officers who'd been looking into this, and can you actually go and talk to the pilots? So this officer reported back to me a while later, and he said, I've spoken to de Brouwer, I've spoken to the F-16 pilots, I've spoken to a few other people on the Belgian air staff, and this is the conclusion. Yes, this happened pretty much as reported in the media and by the ufologists. You know, what you see is what you get. Yes, the pilots were scrambled, locked on, it broke the lock. Yes, it is still unexplained. And then he said to me, almost as an aside, that they had turned to him at the end and said some kind of light-hearted but a little bit of steel running through it comment, well, thank goodness they weren't hostile. And the subtext was, because if they had have been, there'd be nothing we could have done, not even in our F-16s. The F-16 is still a pretty good aircraft. In 1993, I got caught up in a major wave of sightings over the United Kingdom. I came in one morning and I think both phones were ringing, and I picked up one of them, and it was from a police officer down in either Devon or Cornwall. And he relayed to me how he and a colleague had been on night patrol, and they had seen a sort of triangular or diamond-shaped UFO. Over the course of that day, reports came in thick and fast from police officers, from the media, from members of the public, and then I got the two really interesting reports. The first one was from a guard patrol at an Air Force base, RAF Cosford, and the guard patrol submitted an official report in which they talked about this object flying directly over the base with 3 lights in the shape of a perfect triangle on the underside. Then I got a call from the meteorological officer at RAF Shawbury, a base just down the road. Now there were hardly any people around. This was like about 1 o'clock at night. There was only a skeleton crew out, and this guy was in a building by himself. He gets a call. It's from Cosford. It's about 10 or 12 miles down the road. Cosford say to him, "You're not going to believe this, but we've just had a UFO fly over our base, and what's more, it's coming your way." Well, I think he thought at first that they were playing a joke on him, but he said, okay, he'll go out and he'll take a look. So he just walks out of the building. He looks towards the horizon where he knows RAF Cosford is, and sure enough, there's a bright light in the sky, and it's getting bigger. And he's thinking, okay, now bear in mind, this guy's job, he's the Met officer at the base, and he's in the Air Force. So I would say that whilst there's no such thing as an infallible witness, this is pretty much as good as it gets. He's in the Air Force, so he knows aircraft and helicopters, and he's the Met officer, so he knows his job is to look into the sky and look at, cloud formations and phenomena and make decisions, like the one I mentioned earlier, to bring the aircraft back to base, life and death decisions about flight safety and things. This is a good witness. This is what the witness told me. It got bigger and bigger, and his jaw was getting lower and lower, and this thing, suddenly he said he could see what it was, and he said to me, this was a triangular or diamond-shaped craft, to use a non-technical analogy, almost like a slice of pizza, but maybe a little thicker in the middle, extra crust. He said that it had 3 bright lights on the underside. It was coming quite slowly towards the base, probably no more than 20 or 30 miles an hour when it was right at its closest point. Then he said that a pencil-thin beam of light came down from the craft and started swinging backwards and forwards across some fields just beyond the perimeter fence. He said he could hear a low-frequency humming sound coming from this craft, which he said not only could he hear it, he could feel it. It was one of those uncomfortable low-frequency sounds like when you stand in front of a bass speaker and something like that. You know, he said it went right through him. It really kind of unnerved him. I said to him, how big was this thing? And being a military man and knowing his aircraft, he said midway in size between a C-130 Hercules transport aircraft and, a Boeing 747 jumbo jet. He said. So I said, okay, pretty big. How high? Circa 200 feet above and circa 200 feet to the side of where he was stood. The beam of light suddenly retracted, and he said suddenly, and I think anyone that's looked into UFOs is going to know what I'm going to say next, suddenly it moved from a very slow speed to an extremely high speed and just shot off to the horizon. And when I said estimate, it's 5 or 10 times faster than a military jet, something like that. No sonic boom, interestingly enough. I launched possibly the most comprehensive investigation that I'd ever launched into this. Really pulled out all the stops. We approached, this time we really did approach the Americans. We went through the British Embassy in Washington and we said, ask the Americans, do they have a hypersonic experimental prototype aircraft, an operational one? Is it a replacement for the SR-71 Blackbird? Is it something else? Don't let's get hung up on definitions. Just tell them what happened and say, look, okay, we might not have a need to know any technical details, but just tell us, look, was it you? Now, we kind of pretty much knew that it couldn't have been anyway because there are very strict rules about diplomatic clearance of flights, which is something that I subsequently got involved with myself. But we thought we had to ask the question. The answer that came back was very interesting. It was, no, the Americans don't have anything like that capable of the sorts of speeds and maneuvers that you've described and characteristic with that shape. However, they want to ask if you, the British, have something like that, because the Americans have a few UFO cases like that still. And they want to know, does the Royal Air Force have something? And our response was, our private response was, well, we wish. But no, we didn't. One other, just to finish the story of the investigation, drew a complete blank. I kicked this one higher up the chain of command than I usually would have done. Many UFO sightings didn't get kicked up the chain of command at all. I would often take a decision that there was simply nothing else to be done with the case because the details were so vague, all you could do was stick it on the file. But this one, from memory, I kicked this upstairs either to defence ministers or to the Assistant Chief of the Air Staff, or to both. I can't remember. The document will probably come out next year under the Freedom of Information Act, so we'll probably find out. It went up, and then I was a victim of my own success, because the answer came back, very interesting, great investigation, but it was such a great and thorough investigation, we can't think of anything else that you could usefully do with this. That's it. Object unexplained, case closed. I don't know. One final footnote on that particular case, it happened late, when you look at all the sightings, and when you put them together, there were several dozen. They were late on the 30th of March and in the early hours of the 31st of March 1993. Something went click in my head, and I recalled that, of course, the Belgian sightings had been on exactly that same night 3 years ago. It was the 30th and the 31st of March. That's when the Belgian incident happened, back in 1990. What could this mean? Well, my only theory was that because the 31st of March sightings were really, in the early hours, it would have been too late, even if the media did pick up the story, to run with it on the 31st of March. So even if the media picked up the story would probably run on the 1st of April. And, who's going to pay much attention to a UFO sighting reported in the paper on April Fool's Day? Does that indicate an intelligence of some sort at work here? Is it the one night that you could get away with it, flying something low and slow right over the heads of Joe Public and even the military? And I tell you what, every year on 30th and 31st of March, I kind of still think to myself, I wonder, if, and I must suggest that people use that night for sky watches more. I keep thinking, is it going to happen again? Is history going to repeat itself? How long have I been talking here? About an hour and 10 minutes already. Let me take a break here and throw it open to you for some questions. Anyone got anything?
Yes. I came a little late. You may have gone into it, but could you give an update in terms of the Rendlesham Forest incident, in terms of any new information that's come out since some things have been publicized on cable TV and magazines?
The question relates to the Bentwaters case, the Rendlesham Forest. I haven't covered that. I'll cover it. I'll probably finish up on that, in fact. So I'll come. No, I tell you what. Let me do that now. Why don't I do that now? Yes, we've had a number of recent new documentaries on that. Timothy Good has been involved in that as well, and appeared on that particular program. With myself and with some others. And I think, Tim, correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the most interesting things about certainly the UFO invasion at Rendlesham documentary is that for the first time, General Gordon Williams appeared. Was it that one he was on, wasn't it?
I think so.
Yes. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that General Gordon Williams has now gone on the record and spoken about this case. Now, important to say, he is speaking about it in fairly dismissive terms, but the important point is that you now have the guy who was commanding officer of Bentwaters Woodbridge at the time on the public record for the first time. That in itself is important, not least because he retired as a general, and there are still not too many generals who are going to give TV interviews about UFOs, even skeptical ones. Well, General Gordon Williams came over to England a few years back, and I was fortunate to have dinner with both him and with Georgina Bruni, who wrote a book on the case called You Can't Tell the People. We had an interesting time. We couldn't really get the general to really sort of open up on this. Maybe there was nothing to open up about. But also in the audience we have Peter Robbins over here, the co-author of Left at Eastgate, one of the other seminal books on this subject. So again, and Peter, if I get anything wrong here, shout out at me.
You're getting it all wrong, Nick.
Okay. And this you will know, as well as Gordon Williams, I think a couple of other witnesses appeared in that for the first time. Was it Ed Kavanaugh's first TV interview?
The one on the Sci-Fi Channel that was aired early this year in the States indeed was. And also, of course,
was it Ray Gulias, or was he on CNN one?
Ray Gulias was actually in the very first
Oh, yes.
special report in 1984.
Okay, sorry, I know. Yeah, I know how you mean. It was Monroe Nevels who was the other new witness. Now, Nevels is the guy who operated the Geiger counter, who took those historic radiation readings that Charles Holt took. And, both me looking at this case retrospectively when I was doing that job, and documents subsequently made available and now on the Ministry of Defence website, actually, which is mod.gov.uk, the Ministry of Defence has proactively published some documents, the whole Rendlesham file, or everything they could find. And what's unusual about that is it's one of the few instances where UFO documents from the Defence Intelligence staff have been made available. So the Defence Intelligence staff documents on the MOD website, and the fact that Gordon Williams, Munro Nevels and Ed Kavanasak have all spoken out for the first time. That's important. Kavanasak is hugely important because he was there on the first night of activity, and he was part of the same patrol that Jim Penniston and John Burroughs were in. And don't forget, that's the patrol that certainly, if you speak to Jim Penniston, he says he got right up close enough to touch this and look at the hieroglyphs on the side. So that's really what I would say to you is the new information about Rendlesham. Tim, Peter, is there anything you'd like to add on that?
Not really. You've got about 160 pages of documents, as I recall, in the newer file, the one most recently released. And although in going through them very carefully, there's certainly no smoking gun and one would not expect to find it. But there is a lot of interesting smoke, and one gets a very real sense of the abiding interest that the ministry had in this, and that it was not a joke when it was going on.
That's interesting. I mean, as Peter says, 160, 180 odd pages in that file. No smoking gun, but plenty of smoke. I think that's a pretty good analogy. There are certainly some intriguing dead ends. When Defence Intelligence 52 analysed the radiation readings and said this is higher than we would expect by a factor of about 10, they made an offer and they said, well, do you want us to go and check this out? What the file doesn't reveal is whether that offer was taken up. If it was taken up, what happened? If it wasn't taken up, why the heck not? When you have multiple military witnesses talking about a structured craft. And by the way, yeah, although the memo, of course, is entitled Unexplained Lights, you don't have to get very far into the memo to realize that we are talking about a landed metallic craft. And that's the phrase that's used. So that's fascinating. There may well be further documents to be discovered on that. I'm sure there are. Doesn't mean that they've necessarily been spirited away in a sinister conspiracy. Bureaucracies like that. I've worked, like I say, for nearly 19 years now in the Ministry of Defence, and without wanting to make myself sound too incompetent, I sometimes can't find papers I was working on last week. So when someone actually applies for papers from 1980 on a particular case where a number of different divisions were involved, it doesn't surprise me that things have either got misfiled or have just been lost or fallen down the back of a cupboard. These things happen. I know they've happened to me on non-conspiratorial subjects like army pensions, or if you can lose a file on army pensions, you don't get people saying there's a sinister conspiracy. They don't want the truth about army pensions and the latest inflationary uplift, coming out. So that's interesting. Yeah.
In the government environment, have you ever had someone take your file off your desk?
I've never had a file taken off my desk. I have occasionally had people say, I think you've spent enough time on that particular investigation, but again, I could not stand here and say to you that I felt that there was anything sinister about that. I think it might simply be more a question of workload, and look, you've wasted a day on that. If you haven't cracked it in a day, from the vague details you've got, you're not. So stop wasting your time and get on with your work.
I've got another question. 2 days before this conference, I was on Route 1, which is the main East Coast highway, going to my house. 3 city police cars were at the same light as I was. I saw a craft that was silent, had 5 lights, and went like this. Has there been any crafts in England that have had a pattern like this?
I can't recall anything with quite that sort of staircase motion. Tim, anything in your case files like that sort of movement? Similar?
It had
Um,
5 lights. They were diamond white, clear, star-shaped lights. 1 large in the center and 2 on each side. And when the plane or craft or whatever it was stopped at each of these stair-step patterns, when it stopped, it was as if it posed and the light pattern changed.
No, that's interesting. Now let me ask.
At that point, we were at a traffic light. We went home. We were sorry we went home because the 3 city police cars that were also stopped at that light turned and zoomed in that direction as if to chase us. They had their heads out the car.
Okay, a question for you. Did you report it to anyone?
No, but I'm tempted to call the Alexandria City since 3 police cars, 6 people saw it with us.
Yeah.
And
Well,
maybe the police filed a report.
it might be worth. I would encourage you to maybe make some inquiries, or if you're in a local UFO group, or contact the local MUFON group, or indeed look at it yourself. But yeah, that's very interesting. Thanks for that.
And they said they were going to survey, but I've never heard of a survey plane with a camera that moved like that.
No. Okay. Thanks for that.
I'm just curious, given your position and the information you have been veiled to, what are your conclusions?
Sorry. What?
Given the information you've been privy to, what are your conclusions?
My conclusions. Okay, I'll give it to you in a nutshell. Most UFO sightings, I have no doubt, are explainable, or there is insufficient data to make an explanation. Somewhere around about 5%, but maybe even less than that, maybe between sort of 2 and 5%, I think have an exotic explanation, but I will be a real civil servant and a bureaucrat and hedge my answer a little bit. I will say, yes, there could be a number of potential exotic explanations to these sorts of phenomena. The extraterrestrial hypothesis is certainly something that I've considered. Do I think there is evidence that would support an extraterrestrial explanation for some UFOs? Yes, I do. Do I think there's proof? No, I don't think we're quite there yet. That's my conclusion in a nutshell. It's probably a cautious, governmental answer, but I suspect that actually I go rather further than most people in government would in saying that I think there is evidence that would support that.
Nick, under the policy of the emergency investigations and the UFO desk, and the term, the requirements of the investigation, and the term no defence significance or defence significance for the security of the country, does that encapsulate UFO sightings that are linked with forensic witness evidence of abductions? I know you discussed abductions in your second book, but is abductions part of no defence or defence significance?
Well, that's...
Can you repeat the question? Some people
Okay,
couldn't hear
sure.
the question.
Well, the question is about abductions and how that would fit in to the idea of defence significance. I received, when I was doing that job from 91 to 94, probably no more than half a dozen alien abduction accounts, and there wasn't much more I could do than just talk people through the options, give them a warning about regression hypnosis, and say at least, I was going to say at least go in with your eyes open, so to speak. But I believed that, yes, of course, self-evidently, if these things were happening as the abductees were reporting they were happening, that they were being taken from their environment and they were having a non-consensual procedure carried out on them, then I felt that clearly this must be of defence significance. However, if you think it was difficult for me to engage some of my bosses on the UFO issue, think how more difficult it was for me to engage them on the alien abduction issue. Just an anecdote, and I don't mean to make light of this, but some years after I left, an abductee felt so strongly about at that point that she wrote to one of my successors, and she said, what is the Ministry of Defence's policy on alien abductions? You know, what are you, the Ministry of Defence, going to do to defend me when these things are happening? And the reply came back, abduction is a criminal offence and as such a matter for the police. So now, the letter went on to say, you know, in terms of alien abduction, we have no evidence that would support the reality of these claims. You know, but I think it was an interesting letter nonetheless. The ministry does get itself into these slightly difficult positions from time to time, particularly when the media decide to have a little fun with it. When the film Independence Day came up, a national newspaper decided to do a story about what would really happen if aliens invade. So they phoned up the Ministry of Defence and they said, well, what if Independence Day happened for real? What would you do? And the press officer said words to the effect of, civil defence is a matter for the Home Office. You know, we suggest you contact them. So the reporter phoned up the Home Office and their press officer said, you've guessed it, don't worry, the Ministry of Defence would leap into action. Yeah. How are we off? We've got 5 minutes, I think. Let's finish up with some questions, shall we? Yeah.
Follow up on this gentleman's question. I realize that you didn't have that many reports on abductions, you know, in the MOD, your office. But if you read the literature in for instance, European or other international literature on this phenomenon, do you find that there's a lot more reports coming out of literature from the United States compared to the Europeans, let's say, or Asians? Is this an international phenomenon, or is it tend to have a heavier reportage in the literature in the U.S.?
Abduction and alien contact is a truly global phenomenon, and you know, I think again it sort of ties back to that point I was making right at the beginning about how the media can create a momentum. I think the reason there's this perception that abduction is an American phenomenon is simply because most of the better known abduction researchers who are published on the subject are American. You know, people like Bud Hopkins, Dave Jacobs and John Mack. Now as it happens, after I left the MOD's UFO desk, when I wrote my second book on abductions, that caused an awful lot of people to contact me on the case, and in varying degrees. You know, I've probably interacted at some level with around about 100 people making these claims. I'm sure that if other people had the same opportunity to write in other countries, the reports, it's about the phrase I use, is there a receptive environment into which such reports can be placed? Do the abductees and experiencers feel do they even know where to go? Do they feel there's someone they can go to who will be non-judgmental and who can offer them coping resources? You know, well, you know, if they're in the States and they sort of are familiar with the works of someone like Bud Hopkins, then the answer to that sort of question is, well, yes, there is that receptive environment. In other countries where maybe the UFO researchers are not that active or there haven't been books published on it, probably not.
Within the Washington environment, it's seen by bureaucrats as something laughable. It's seen as something to send to another agency, as you mentioned, where they pass the buck. And it's seen as if someone within the bureaucracy says, well, I think the people have a right to know, it's usually met with a, yeah, well, we're not going to let them know. So it is seen as a laughable thing. We do not have a desk within our establishment as you do.
No. Well, that's interesting, because certainly in America, your public position is that since 1969 and the closing down of Blue Book, there's been no official project. You mentioned.
I want to say that I have looked in card catalogs at higher levels for these project names
Okay.
I have looked and put my job
Okay.
on the line to look, and there are not cards for those project names.
Okay. Well, what I would say, you mentioned the giggle factor. That's a problem in the United Kingdom too, and yet sometimes there are some opportunities to address that. And in fact, just shortly before this conference, both Timothy Good and myself spoke to a journalist from the Sunday Times. You know, probably Britain's most prestigious Sunday newspaper. So there are journalists who are willing to take a look at that. I haven't seen how the articles come out yet, but over the years, the media, it's been a mixed bag. There will be some people who will be light-hearted, but there have been some serious pieces too.
Not saying within the
So-
government, it's
okay.
as a no or a laugh.
Yeah.
And my other question for you, you mentioned to be cautious of the realm of hypnotism. And my other question is, how does the alien abduction differ from a 2-day psychosis or a hypnotic state? How do we know that someone isn't influencing these people to think they have this?
Well, you know, that's possible. That's probably something that Peter Robbins afterwards would be better placed to discuss because of his work with Bud Hopkins. Sorry, there was a question over there.
Philip believes it's on record as believing in UFOs.
Prince Philip. I'd better not talk. Yeah, I'd better not talk about Prince Philip because of my current position. I'll let Tim say something about that in a minute. What I will say is that a number of those senior establishment figures of that era, like Earl Mountbatten and Lord Dowding, you know, were extremely interested in this and were quite outspoken in their belief in a truly exotic nature of this phenomenon. I think afterwards maybe ask Tim about Prince Philip, but I'd better not in my position make a comment as a serving government official.
I had a friend who lived in England and used to walk on the moors, and he said he saw a black box hovering, which I've never heard of like that here, maybe.
A black box.
Black box hovering, and he's highly rational and he reported it to the police, and they said, oh yes, we get those reports all the time, we know they're there.
The UFOs come, I mean, the one thing that I found is that although there are these popular conceptions of UFOs as being particular shapes, if you look at the case files, they really do come in all shapes and sizes. I mean, sometimes people, if it's a bit vague, because if they think that UFOs, oh, they're all triangular these days, they might be more likely to say, oh, well, it was sort of triangular-ish shaped. But yeah, I've come across round, square, triangle, you know, yeah, all sorts of shapes and sizes. I think we've hit 3 o'clock, which is the 1.5 hour mark. So I'm going to wrap it up there. I'll be around and about afterwards, but thanks very much.